Hello and welcome to Global Connections. I'm Patrick Bratton, hosting today. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, a good friend of mine, Dean Allison Gough at Hawaii Pacific University, who's the incoming head of the new honors program that HPU is developing. So today we're going to talk to Allison, get a kind of a snapshot of her background, some of the interesting work that she's done on the African American experience during the Second World War, and then of course talk about the honors program that she's getting started at HPU. So without any further ado, Allison, welcome to Global Connections.
Thank you for having me on the show, Patrick.
Is this your first time on Global Connections?
It is my first time. I'm a complete newbie. Yes.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Good to have you down here with Jay and Zuri and Nick and the whole ThinkTech team. Now, I'm sure you get asked this question a lot. Gough is a Welsh name, correct?
It is a Welsh name. Supposedly, it's a corruption of the word goch. You've got to use a lot of phlegm there, and it means red-headed, as in temper, not as in coloration. But, you know, I'm fairly mild personality.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And I know you went to university in Wales too. So
I did. I spent 3 interesting years in Aberystwyth, which in Welsh means basically an estuary, the water's supple mouth, if you will. Yes, so it was quite an interesting time amongst the sheep and other things.
We're famous for that.
Yes, very famous. So you were Welsh in origin?
My father's side of the family is Welsh. My mother's side going back is French, I believe, way back. So,
oh, okay. So French and Welsh.
French and Welsh.
And then you grew up mostly?
I grew up in England, just outside Oxford, about 30 miles outside Oxford, in a couple of villages, very agricultural communities, more pigs than people.
Okay.
Right on the edge of the Cotswolds, so very beautiful and very historic part of the country.
Okay. And so did you go to college in that area? Or?
No, I went to university in Durham. That's in the north of England, not North Carolina. People tended to want to go to university as far away from their home as they possibly could get in Britain, which was about 200 miles for me.
Okay.
So, different scale, right, to the United States. So I went there, but I went there because very much like the Oxford, Oxbridge system, a collegiate system, extremely good reputation for history. And as you know, people in Britain specialize as soon as they get into university. We don't have the whole general education thing. So it had an outstanding reputation for history, which it still does. It's ranked, I think, #1 for history in United Kingdom now, above Cambridge and Oxford.
Oh, wow,
so
okay.
I chose to go there and study medieval history, at least at first.
Medieval history?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
yes.
what drew you? Torture, plague?
Well, yeah, all of those things. One of the villages I grew up in Britain was mentioned in the Domesday Book. There were always archaeological digs going on there. There's a medieval church there. And so I was just naturally, drawn to it. And then I had a absolutely amazing high school teacher who, for our ordinary levels, O levels as they used to be called, made us do medieval history, which was very unusual at the time. And it was just a great experience. And so that's what I gravitated towards. And Durham had an excellent reputation for medieval history. I worked with Michael Prestwich, who is well known in military history, circles as well for his work on medieval warfare. I worked with Robin Frame, who was a pioneering history of medieval Ireland, and also managed to explore medieval Wales as well there, which was something you don't get to do in a lot of universities, at least outside Wales. So it just had a stellar reputation, and it's a beautiful place, obviously. And to wake up every morning and look out of my window and see a Norman cathedral was pretty cool, and some of the students got to live in the medieval castle there in the Motte Bailey. So yeah, a truly unique experience. And as a historian, it can't be beat, really.
So what were you planning to do? Like, sort of, what did you, when you were doing medieval history, what did you think about doing your dissertation on?
Well, I didn't think about grad school. I hadn't thought that far. I was just happy to be going to university. I was the first person in my family to go to university, so I was just glad to get there. And I actually toyed with going to law school for a while, and actually got in, but then I thought better of it, I guess. And during my time there, they forced us to take something in the modern period, which I didn't want to do. I was very resistant to that. So I ended up taking an American history course and then got totally hooked. And so I had this very weird, bifurcation between medieval history and American history. And then I also had minors in political science and geography as well. So I kind of ended up in American history, which is really my field now by default. And again, great influence of some great tutors there. Howell Harris, who's really well published in labor and business history, and one of the foremost American historians, at least of his time in Britain. American history wasn't taught a great deal in Britain at the time. East Anglia had and still has a great program. It's expanded now, but there weren't many places that actually offered American history. So I was kind of lucky to benefit from them.
It's funny you mentioned that this will sound silly, but one of the surprises I had when I went to a British university is that you could get a degree in American Studies. And this thought never occurred to me being from the United States. You get a degree in American Studies. I mean, in the US we do that, Russian Studies or Chinese Studies. But it seemed very novel to me to have an American Studies degree.
Yeah.
What would you say? I mean, you've been teaching American history now. I mean, what's before we get into some of your other studies that you've done, what would you say is the difference between, say, how American history is taught in the U.S. compared to how it's taught in the UK?
People always ask me that question, and especially my students who I think don't quite believe me when I'm talking about the American Revolution. They think I'm going to give them a slightly colored view, shall we put it that way. But I think in many ways American history in Britain is taught more in the context of the Atlantic world, obviously, because of this historic connection, especially if you're teaching the early period, if you're studying the early period of American history. So when I was studying early American history, we paid a lot more attention to parallel events that were going on, not just in Britain, but in France and in the whole European context. So I think in Britain you do get that wider context that sometimes you don't get here. And maybe that might be a product of, this idea of American exceptionalism. Nobody really wants to look at some of the similarities and roots and connections. But I think actually now American history as it's being taught and practiced in America is actually coming around to that sort of view of America as a greater, America, that it doesn't end right at the Atlantic coast or the Pacific coast. And that's one of the changes I've seen in American history over the past 20 plus years since, I was an undergraduate in Britain and then a graduate student at Ohio State. I think there's a much bigger context now for American history in America. I know I'm probably going to offend some Americans who have always done that, especially in the realm of, foreign and military policy, but in social policy you didn't really see that, I think, in American history until fairly recently. And of course recent is a relative term for historians, right? So,
sure, of course. You mentioned Ohio State, so you were up in the north of England studying in Durham, and then you went to Ohio, of all places.
Yes, the Ohio State University, I'm told I have to call it. Yes, there was a kind of pseudo exchange program at Durham, whereby Durham graduates would go there and vice versa. It tended to be one-sided. We'd sent a lot of people to Ohio State, and not a lot of people had come back. It all started from one of the American historians teaching there for a semester, getting the equivalent of a sabbatical and going to teach at Ohio State. And he set up this program. I think it had been going for about 10 years by the time I went. And we had a steady stream of students. They're usually going for an MA, but we had a couple of students that had gone and got their PhDs and are now teaching in American universities. Richard Dams, who's a foreign policy historian, right, is teaching, I think, still in Mississippi, right? So he was at Durham. And so there are a number of pioneers, and so myself and actually Dr. Russell Hart, who you interviewed the other week, got on this program and ostensibly went to Ohio State for a 1-2 year period for an MA, and I went and basically never went home again. So.
Okay. What was it about? I mean, the way that it was a particular instructor, or was it the American system versus the British system, or what was the thing that hooked you?
Yeah, I think it really was the American system. I applied to several, graduate programs in Britain, and they're very, as you know, kind of narrow, and maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. I didn't think it was particularly good. You do your dissertation, and that is it. And I'd seen a friend of mine kind of going through the process at that time. And what attracted me to the American system, particularly Ohio State, was they gave you a very broad training. And it was only gradually that I decided, yes, I want to be an academic. But they really prepared you well for that. They make you take a wide range of courses. At Ohio State, they were very good about providing training for teaching, which is not done everywhere, but that is something that you get in America that you don't get in Britain. You're just like thrown into the classroom, and not always with great success. So those were some of the things that attracted me. And then my advisor at Ohio State was Warren Van Tyne, absolutely phenomenal guy. by, he's written, well, countless books. Probably the best known of his books is a book he co-wrote with Melvin Dubofsky on the great John L. Lewis, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. And, you know, Warren was always very supportive, and he's also in that kind of genre of labor historians, that's how I started off, that want to make historical writing accessible, which is something that I'm very adamant about. I study theory, I understand theory, you did a lot of that at Ohio State, but he was very adamant that you don't need to let the theory get in the way of being able to communicate what you're trying to say. And I think you and I know that sometimes we still need dictionaries to understand some of the books that are being put out, and they're really written for a very small audience. It's very insular, and Warren really wasn't about that. He could write a thoroughly academic book that was absolutely accessible to students and to the public as well, which is, I think, why his book was nominated for a Pulitzer. I'd also met Melvin Dubofsky when he visited England, and he was a friend of my tutor there, so I kind of had that connection, and to say the vibe was good, I guess that's certainly true. And Mel knew Warren and suggested, you know, this might be a good kind of fit. So he was a very important reason that I went to Ohio State. And then the second person who was very influential was Lila Roop, who was a very progressive women's historian at the time, and she along with Susan Hartman started a very strong women's history and women's studies program at Ohio State, so that was one of my minor fields. Also extremely supportive in the same sort of genre in many ways as Warren, in that wants to make history really accessible. And that's problematic in women's history, which is sometimes bedeviled, right, by a lot of theory, right? So really very much those two figures were important in me coming to Ohio State, and they remained very supportive throughout my long drawn-out career there. Yeah.
What was your doctoral dissertation?
My doctoral dissertation was on the transatlantic anti-slavery movement. So I started looking at really the American anti-slavery movement, but what happened to it after the Brits abolished slavery in the 1830s, and then they started soliciting and getting help from the kind of leftover abolitionists in Britain. So this is one thing, well, there are a couple of things that really interest me. I'm interested in social movements, and obviously given my background, I'm really interested in the internationalization of social movements. And going back to what I said about the greater America, I'm interested in, you know, Atlantic movements in particular. And I'd looked at that to some degree with the women's movement, and I then began to kind of apply it to the American context. So my dissertation basically took the anti-slavery movement from the 1830s up to the abolition of slavery, but then up to 1900, because I'm also very, very interested in what happens to social movements in periods where the climate is not supportive of them. How do they function? They're for the women's movements, for anti-slavery, for civil rights in particular, we tend to think, you know, that the movements, you know, are active for a period, then they completely disappear, and then somehow, through some form of immaculate conception, they are reborn again. I'm interested in looking at continuities and what happens, you know, in those gap periods. So I kind of added that a little bit onto the end of my dissertation as a kind of way to explain what happened to all those activists afterwards, and to kind of point the way to how the ideology, if not the personnel, would survive into the 20th century to be kind of reborn later in the modern civil rights movement. So those are things I'm interested in.
Because it's one thing that always strikes me when you look at sort of long duration histories, because the view that we have looking back is often shaped by the generations that you have nowadays. And so, you know, I don't always make myself popular when I say this, but you know, very, very much so in the United States, we have this sort of short-term view that basically all social movements pop up mysteriously in the 60s, right? And all of a sudden, you know, because of rock music and whatever, the Beatles, all of a sudden we've got social movements as if those things never existed in the 1930s or in the 1890s.
Yeah. And that was something that particularly bedeviled the women's movement. Right? There was no connection made between the generation that got women the vote, and then the 1960s. So, for some reason, between 1920 and 1960s, these issues weren't important. And of course they were, and a sociologist, Verta Taylor, has kind of worked on that, and I did borrow some ideas from her to look at the civil rights movement, because she theorizes that what social movements do is to use abeyance structures to keep both personnel and to keep both ideas alive. So the personnel and the ideas kind of mutate into different, organizations, but they're kept alive until the social climate is fruitful enough for them to be reborn. And I think that's exactly what happened to the civil rights movement. So you do have continuities between, it's a century before the anti-slavery and the modern civil rights movement. And my kind of work on World War II, which we'll talk about later, is kind of part of that belief.
Okay. And so, judging from what you wrote on your dissertation, coming here to Hawaii Pacific, I mean, what are sort of the courses that you're doing where a lot of your research is sort of influenced?
Yeah. Well, I do the usual American survey courses, and I try to inject, obviously, what I'm doing into there. But at an upper division level for history students, I teach a course on the African diaspora. So I'm looking at African populations in an even wider context than they have been, which is a global context. And so we examine African communities around the world, but not in isolation, but part of this interconnected group from about the period of slavery up to the middle of the 20th century. So that's one way that my research is coming, is being brought into the classroom. I also teach a course on the Atlantic world, okay, which is part of my interest, right, on the larger America, which takes it again from the era of colonization up to about the end of the 19th century. And obviously there you can talk about slavery, you can talk about all of these social movements, including abolitionism, as part of that interconnected, Atlantic world. And then finally, of course, I just taught actually this semester, I teach a course on women in America. Again, with the idea of teaching it as part of a wider context. So you can't understand, colonial women's lives without understanding what's going on in Europe. And, people and ideas are part of, the baggage that people kind of bring with them. So, I've been able to bring my interest to bear in those courses. And then a graduate level, generally, I teach a course entitled Race, Sex, and War in U.S. History. And
that's a great title.
It is a great title. It's very sexy and meant to be so attractive. I'm teaching this next semester, in case anybody wants to sign up for that, Wednesday nights. It's actually going to be a mixed undergraduate and graduate course, which I'm very excited about, because there's always a great deal of synergy, I think, there, and it's great to challenge undergraduate students there. And it basically focuses on the way that warfare has influenced minority groups and social movements, and vice versa as well. So this semester next semester I'm going to take the course basically from the 19th century through the 20th century, and kind of keep it compacted into those two centuries. So we'll look at how African Americans traditionally have used warfare to further, civil rights, not just in World War II. We'll look at the role of women in warfare. We look at how warfare has created ideas of masculinity and subjects such as that. So these are all areas that reflect a lot of my research, I think.
All right. We'll come back to your research in just a second. We're going to take a short commercial break and be right back with Global Connections.
Aloha. My name is Jim Sean, and I'm host of a show called Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers. Each week, live streaming at noon on ThinkTech Hawaii, we interview people who have special insights into education, from early education through K-12, all the way through higher education and beyond. Both public and private are areas we're interested in. We dig deeper. We try to find out what it's really like to be involved in making change, advocating for it, how you reform, what people's philosophies are in reforming it. As I said, we're live streaming every Wednesday at noon on ThinkTech Hawaii. And later on, you can find these interviews on YouTube and on the Hawaii Educational Policy Center website. We hope you join us as many times as possible. Aloha.
Hello, and welcome back to Global Connections. I'm Patrick Bratton. We're talking with Dean Allison Gough, talking about her teaching, and we'll be talking about her research and some of the work. So you had mentioned you've been teaching this course on race, sex, and war and U.S. history. And so I remember seeing a presentation that you did a couple of years ago, talking a bit about, you've been doing a lot of work on sort of the African-American experience in World War II, which has, we have a kind of a pop cultural sort of awareness of this through movies and films and books and things like that. What was the thing that drew you to this subject?
As I kind of explained in the first segment, a lot of my experiences have been random or fortuitous, and this was one of those cases. I was going through the papers of the NAACP looking for something else, and I thought maybe I would do a project on plantation culture in Hawaii, and I knew that the NAACP had been involved in some way in trying to actually protect plantation workers' rights here, and they'd been involved in some of the strikes that had gone on here. So I was just, spieling through some of the papers, because you have to look on microfilm, obviously, which is awful. And literally something just popped up on the page. It said Mutiny Hawaii 1944. And I had never heard of this. And so I investigated, and sure enough, there was a mutiny in July of 1944 out at Bellows, what is now Bellows Base, and a whole new kind of research project kind of came from that chance encounter with something that
at Bellows in the middle of World War II.
Yes, yes.
That's news to me, and
Yes.
probably news to most people.
Yes, well, some has been written about race in World War II in Hawaii, not much about African Americans. We're actually very important in these islands. The pre-war census of Hawaii lists approximately 200 African Americans in Hawaii in about, I think it's about 1940, 1941. Those figures aren't very accurate because they're a very weird way of accounting people on the base of race. They somehow, sometimes listed African Americans as Puerto Ricans, and Puerto Ricans were sometimes listed as white. So it's very confusing.
Right.
But there are about 200. But during the course of the war, between about 1942 and 1945, 30,000 African Americans were stationed here or passed through the islands. So this is an enormous demographic shift for a group of islands that's already, very, very heterogeneous. And despite what people might write about still, or what people said at the time, they were fraught, right, with racial issues and problems. I mean, the Massey affair was still burning people up, even though that was 10 years before the war. So I thought this was interesting, and so I started looking at the specific incident that happened. So at Bellows in July of 1944, about a third of Company E of the 1320th General Engineer Services Regiment had refused to turn out for work. They'd been over at Bellows, they'd been engaged in stacking salvaged lumber at Ala Moana, somewhere on Ala Moana Boulevard. And just one evening they refused to turn out for work. When they were ordered to go to work, to go back to their mess tents and collect their rations and everything, they refused to turn out again. The commanding officer, Colonel Howson, ordered them to turn out, warned that they'd be prosecuted under the 66 Article of War, still wouldn't turn out. A few people that turned out and attempted to board the buses to go to Ala Moana were pelted with rocks, and there was a 2-hour melee with MPs that resulted. Everybody was finally, sent back to camp, and an investigation occurred. It ended in a court-martial trial, and 69 people were found guilty under the 66th Article of War. They were sentenced to 15 years hard labor and dishonorably discharged from the military. And I thought this was very interesting because you never read about this. Beth Bailey and David Farber have written a great book on World War II Hawaii that has a chapter on race and African Americans in particular called The First Strange Place. But they focus on the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Coastal Artillery, and their experiences in Hawaii. And, you know, obviously the Harlem Hellfighters have got a lot of attention, but of course they're not representative of either most African Americans who were stationed here or most African Americans who were active in the war, because most African Americans were non-combatants. They were like my guys, you know, from E Company. They were general laborers, they were chauffeurs, they were engaged in non-combatant service roles. So this kind of triggered me to look for other incidents, right, of what the military called mutiny, or they also called them acts of disobedience and riot. And I began to think of these in terms of kind of nascent civil rights protests, because the more you dig into the 1944 incident, the more you realize this is what it is. The discontent with these group of guys goes back a long, long time. It goes back to the mainland. Most of them came from Camp Swift, Texas. They were moved here in 1943, but when they were in Texas, they had a history of protesting what was going on there. As you know, and most people know, you know, the military was segregated in World War II, but they were stationed all around the country in areas, you know, that were segregated or were not particularly welcoming to African American troops, and Camp Swift in Texas was one of those areas. The local mayor of the local town told them that he'd shoot any African Americans who walked into town. So they organized a protest whereby they walked into town en masse, and there were several incidents of that kind. You know, these were premeditated, organized things, and I don't see these as acts of disobedience, but really acts of protest, right, that kind of presage what's going to happen in the civil rights movement. So these guys had a history of activism. They're brought, you know, a lot of them together and reformed as the 1320th here, and they continue to protest acts of discrimination and segregation in Hawaii. Now, Hawaii wasn't a de facto, you know, de jure segregated area, but it became, you know, a de facto one because the military kind of imported, right. Mainland segregationist practices. And when you read the letters of guys that are stationed here in World War II, first of all, they talk about, this is great, this is paradise, right? There seems to be no racial divide here, we can go where we want, people don't seem to be segregated, and of course a lot of these guys are from the South, you know, originally. And gradually over the course of time, you see what one soldier talked about, this kind of iron curtain almost, he didn't use the word curtain, I think ice curtain or something like that, coming down, the military bringing in, you know, mainland racial attitudes, and effectively this was stifling, right, the freedom that African Americans were experiencing here. So there's the whole background, I think, to what these guys were experiencing in Company E. So what it seems triggered some of their actions were a couple of things. First of all, the military decided that it was going to transfer out gradually all of their black officers. And this became part of military policy. The 1320th has started with a mixed officer corps, but by 1944, the US military had decided this wasn't working, and largely because of some very well-known protest events like at Selfridge Field, where black officers tried to desegregate, right, the officers club, and that just, you know, escalated what was already going on in Detroit, which was a major race right there. So the military decided this wasn't working, so they were just going to staff the 1320th top down with white officers. So they were gradually getting rid of black officers who seemed to be very popular and also very effective in the 1320th. So this actually stimulated a campaign of complaint within the military. And that might seem very minor, but when you're doing that in the military, that's a very big thing. So letter writing, marching into the commandant's office, complaining, these are all things that they were doing. The second incident that seems to have triggered some of this was that one of the men of the 1320th appears to have been murdered at Bellows. And there seems to have been an attempt to cover it up. He was murdered, it seems, by a white MP. And I still can't get the full records of this, but this definitely led to a heightening of tensions there. Before the guys decide they're not going to, you know, turn out for work, they had engaged in some practices that you can kind of trace to protest practices in slavery. And this is where that whole continuity thing that I was talking to you comes in. So they're at Ala Moana in July, a couple of weeks before the mutiny, and they are stacking lumber. And because they kept a lot of records, you can chart how much lumber they stacked on each successive day. So they are, usual record on one day. Then it slips by 50% the next day, and then a further 50% until they're down to stacking 14 pieces of lumber in an 8-hour shift. It seems pretty clear to me that this is a go-slow, right? And which has a very long heritage as part of a traditional, African-American protest. That presages, right, the mutiny. And in between that go slow and the mutiny, there's increased, calls for bringing back the black officers. The last black officer is basically scheduled to be transferred out a couple of days after the mutiny. And so I think this is just an escalating pattern of protest. So it's not something that is what the military classified as disobedience or a lack of discipline. I see this as premeditated and as planned, and as something that practically and ideologically is actually going to give these troops the kind of fuel, the background to do the same in the post-war period. So that's really what I'm kind of interested in looking at, how in a very practical sense World War II provided African Americans with the tools for protest in the post-war period. Because too often we talk about, well, yes, World War II obviously has a link to the civil rights movement, but it's done in very vague terms. Obviously they went overseas and they were treated badly, so they came back and decided they'd seen a different model. We want to have a different model in America. But I think there are far more practical links to this. So that's kind of what the project, the mutiny in Hawaii, kind of stimulated me to kind of look at.
Interesting. Ask a question maybe that's a little bit outside of that, but you kind of tweaked my curiosity. I mean, one thing that's interesting when you look at armies, in this case the United States military, you normally have a certain culture for the peacetime army. And then particularly with the large mobilization with the United States in the Second World War, the Army changes in many ways. And so, for example, for the Army in the Pacific, we have a certain image, particularly sort of immortalized and sort of from here to eternity, both the books and the movie, of the Pineapple Army, the small Pacific sort of imperial army that the United States had in Hawaii and the Philippines and in China. How did that army, in a sense, from what you've seen, how did that army change, in a sense, with the with this massive mobilization in Hawaii to gear up, to fight World War II, and what impact did that have on sort of race relations within the military, like the shift from a small professional, army to this, sort of mass conscript in a sense?
Well, I mean, when you're mass conscripting people in there, I think it's actually heightening racial problems in the military, and this is what the military and the military governor in particular in Hawaii was very worried about. There was a degree, as you know, of pre-war planning for what would happen if the military, came here and was mobilized, and the military governor said, do not send any African Americans here, because I foresee that it's going to undermine military effectiveness, because in the mass conscript army you have people that are not professionalized in that sense, if you want to put it delicately, and then putting them into a situation where Hawaii is already a society that's kind of riven with racial divisions is going to make this more difficult. So I think there's a kind of two-part kind of answer to your question, because you're mobilizing people overseas into cultures that already have distinct ideas about where races fit and behaviors between races. Then a mass conscript army is really going to have potential problems and negative implications. And so you see that in Hawaii, you can see that in Britain, right, as well, which is another kind of part of my study. Britain, which very similar to Hawaii in many ways, apart from the weather, right, is, at the time had a very, very small population of Africans. They tend to be segregated, not legally, but just pure by occupation, because a lot of them were involved in maritime trades. You see people in Bristol and London and Liverpool, but they didn't tend to be out in the more rural central areas of England. And then you have a huge influx, right, of this army into Britain. And African Americans there first say, this is great. And then the American military, because it's having such difficulty between, in a mass conscripted army, says, well, we have to basically enact the same sort of rules that we have in American society in order to keep our force able to fight, essentially. So, I mean, I think what you see in World War II is as a result of this mass conscript army, is the American armies ability to kind of project American racial ideals and racism around the world. And obviously this is not something welcomed by African American troops who see these countries as areas of opportunity and as offering a different model. And so that really does heighten racial tensions within the military globally, I think, during World War II.
Interesting. Well, we'll take a short break and come back. We're Global Connections, and we'll have a few announcements about other ThinkTech programs, and we'll be right back.
Aloha, my name is Kaui Lucas. I am the host of Hawaii is My Mainland, here every Friday on ThinkTech Hawaii at 3 p.m. I invite people who are doing interesting and inspiring things in our community to help us keep it local and keep it real. Tune in any Friday, 3 p.m. and also available on our YouTube channel and my blog, kauilucas.com. Hawaii is my mainland. Aloha.
Hi, I'm your host on ThinkTech Asia, Bill Sharp. I look forward to you joining us each Monday between 4 and 5 o'clock when we film right here in our studio in downtown Honolulu. The show, ThinkTech Asia, focuses on contemporary events in Asia. And by Asia, we mean anything from Hawaii, south to Australia and New Zealand, west to Pakistan, and as far north as the Russian Far East. Clearly, this is one of the most economically dynamic centers of the world, and we bring you up to date on what's going on in a whole host of countries in this very vital region. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Hello, welcome back to Global Connections. I'm Patrick Bratton. I'm talking with Allison Gough about some of her research, and we're going to talk about some other developments that's been happening to her. So I've heard that you've been recently given a new title and position with all the rights and obligations and duties that go along with that.
Those are yet to come, but yes, I have. Oh. I'm now the Dean of the new honors program, which is we have honors at HPU, and we have for a long time, but we have decided to create at least a partially residential honors program, and so I've been appointed as the dean to construct that program. We're going to have our first cohort coming through starting in the fall of 2016. So this year is very much about building the program and enrolling students in something that I think is very exciting, is going to help open a new chapter for HPU.
Well, I mean, other than the sort of obvious residential aspect of it, what's sort of the difference between, say, the traditional honors program you might have been doing and this new sort of residential?
So under our traditional honors program, which was great, students would take honors designated courses in, math or biology, marine science, history, political science. This is, and take them fairly, not randomly, but they could take, what they wanted and then get the honors designation on their certificate afterwards. And they would be in classes with other honors students or maybe non-honors students. And there wasn't necessarily that kind of community cohort, feel about that. This is a real cohort program. And instead of students taking individual disciplinary courses, this program is focused upon interdisciplinary teaching and learning. So it's a 25 to 29 credit program. There are essentially 8 courses, really 6 seminars for students to take that are all interdisciplinary, and most are team taught. So the general idea is to look at some big question, some big issue from 2 wildly different, kind of viewpoints. So for example, one of the courses that has been suggested is that we look at science and science fiction. So, yeah, I think that's kind of interesting. So, what is behind, our obsession with, I don't know, Godzilla. I know you're very interested in that. And where's the science behind that, and what is the science fiction? So, I think that answers a lot of the questions. Or looking at the problem of evil from the perspective of maybe a theologian and a psychologist, or a psychologist and a historian. So these are the things that we're trying to do. So there'll be a series of seminars for students. They'll be limited to 15 students to keep the class small and very interactive and student driven. And they'll be team taught by 2 of our best professors from different disciplines. So students will take a series of those that will gradually build these skills, and then in the senior year they will complete a senior honors project, which could be the traditional thesis, but it could be something creative that they can do in their major. So if they're a biologist, they can do a biology thesis, but they have to have some interdisciplinary aspect to it. So they might do an add-on to that. The idea really here is this. I mean, honors programs traditionally prepare people for graduate school, which of course we're doing. But the other thing we're doing is this. I mean, now people who are graduating from university in the second decade of the 2000s are predicted to have about 11 different careers, right, in the span of their lives. So we need to foster abilities in our students that makes them flexible and able, right, to negotiate a lot of different things that they're going to be asked to do. And I think this interdisciplinary setup that we have there really does that. It promotes thinking outside the box. It promotes the ability to look at questions from different angles. It's very much focused on problem solving as well. The other aspect of the honors program will be that, yes, we want a lot of work done in the classroom, but then how does that apply to the quote-unquote real world? Although I have a problem with that distinction, but anyway. So a lot of our courses will have experiential elements to them. We are going to set students up with a study abroad program as well, and also international internships too, which can be for profit or non-profit organizations, and can be here in Hawaii too, because there are a lot of obviously international non-profits and corporations here too. So the idea is, how do we take what we're talking about in the classroom and really apply it in whatever kind of field you are interested in. So that we're very excited about the extracurricular and co-curricular kind of aspect of that, as well as the in-the-class learning.
Okay, so a lot of sort of active learning, getting out, doing
yeah.
internships, placements, these types of
yeah,
things.
absolutely, yeah, and opening students up to the fact that this is a different world, and Hawaii is very well and uniquely placed, right, in this new environment. So a real stress on global involvement, and so there'll be at least one opportunity to engage in the study abroad during their 4-year program. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, one thing that's always nice, I find, about being downtown is, I mean, you can go from local to sort of national to international very quickly.
Yep.
And have placements for students to do things.
Yeah, absolutely. And the program is going to be centered at our new facility at Lower Tower Marketplace. And I think, as a metaphor for the honors program, I think it's great because you're situated on the historic Lower Tower Marketplace. You're on the port of Honolulu, which transports in and out goods, but also ideas as well. It's like an entrepot, right? And so I think that's something that metaphorically we can kind of capitalize on there. And that's the whole kind of idea of the honors program. It's an exchange of ideas from all over. So I think it's uniquely and very aptly situated at the Lower Tower.
What course or courses are you going to be teaching the program as well as administering it?
I probably will be teaching in it eventually. I have an interest in developing courses on with a physicist, which is scary, but I think interesting. And working on perhaps courses that deal with Hawaiian astronomy and navigation and then Western kind of ideas with that, historically speaking, and also dealing with scientific developments from World War II onwards, the rise of the nuclear age from a scientific and then a kind of social, cultural, historical perspective. So I'm probably teaching a course on that, but largely administering and looking for great courses from our instructors to do that. We've got a lot of good things on the books for students.
One thing that we've often talked about is the ability to teach about politics and history through film. I mean, and I know, like myself, you're a big movie buff. Are there a couple of, like, if you were imagining doing this and this program, I mean, are there a couple of films and a couple of themes you think you would just love to teach to students in terms of a movie to show them?
Yeah. Well, I think we can do that with the nuclear age course. Obviously you're going to show Dr. Strangelove, right? And any number of 1950s sci-fi movies, right? Which are all which are all about the anxiety, right, caused by the nuclear bomb and then later by space exploration. And I think that would we could really get into some of those in a big way. Yeah.
Is this something? One thing also, I mean, you mentioned your interest in the Atlantic world. I mean, maybe one thing would be also, sort of the development of film noir in the 1940s, and both the United States and Europe develop film noirs, but they're different in a sense. I mean, if you look at something like Double Indemnity compared to
Right.
maybe your favorite movie, The Third
Third
Man.
Man, yes.
I mean, what's the kind of a difference would you note from, particularly given your experience, being British but studying in the United States? I mean,
What are the differences
Yeah.
between those two movies? Well, in many ways, I do think the British films are more overtly politicized, right? It's not hard to scratch the surface and see the kind of message there. I think the American movies are, at least Double Indemnity, right? It's not overtly as politicized as the Third Man. And, the British films tend to focus a lot more on, I think, rebuilding, in many ways, not just the physical infrastructure, but the mental infrastructure of Europe. Whereas there's a negativity about American film noir, but there's a very positive side of it as well. A lot of them come out of abundance, right, compared to the European film noir that are born out of the post-war lack of abundance, right, and the destruction of Europe. So I think that's one big difference that I kind of see there.
Interesting. I think we're going to have you come back to Global Connections, and you and I will do a film
Excellent,
talk.
excellent.
I think would be a good
Very
idea.
happy to do that, yes.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have today. We've been talking with Dean Allison Gough from Hawaii Pacific University, talking about her research, talking about her honors program that she's getting going there. I'm Patrick Bratton for Global Connections. Thank you for joining us. We are always live here on Thursdays at 1 p.m., and you can see us also on YouTube and OLLO. And thank you, and aloha.